So thank you everyone for joining us today. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on where we are all coming from today. There's people joining from all across the country. For me, I am on Ngunnawal land and I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present and future. And I look forward to a day where our First Nations people are truly recognised. Thank you for joining us for our fourth seminar as part of our Policy and Advocacy Seminar series. For those that are joining for the first time, welcome. And for those that have been to some of the others, welcome back. It's always nice when people return and get value out of these things. There will be opportunities for questions and answers at the end of Lynley's presentation. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. Or you're also welcome to use the raise your hand function, where that will show me that you're interested in asking a question, and I will be able to give you audio and you can ask Lynley yourself. So there's a couple of options. I'll just keep monitoring that and we can ask questions at the end. We have lots of interest in today's seminar with over 50 people registered, so we'll aim to get to as many as possible. So with that, all that done, all the logistics done, let's get started. I would like to introduce Lynley Ducker, who is presenting our seminar today. Lynley is a committee secretary at the House of Representatives at Parliament House here in Canberra and has been since August 2015. Her previous career in the public service has focused on oversight and accountability roles, including the Australian National Audit Office and Ombudsman offices in both Australia and Papua New Guinea. Lynley has also managed anti-corruption and complaint handling aid programs throughout the Pacific and Indonesia, and has worked as a lawyer for government departments and in the private sector. Today, Lynley will be presenting on the parliamentary committees, their role, membership makeup, why they are important, and you'll get an insider perspective on the parliamentary committee processes. So welcome, Lynley, and I'll hand over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for that introduction. So this is the first time I've ever done a webinar, and it is very weird talking into a screen. The biggest risk we probably face is my elderly laptop running out of charge, and then I'll have to move it over towards the PowerPoint. So that might happen halfway through. But other than that, I think Amy has talked me through the tech. So I'm currently the committee secretary for the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see my PowerPoints. They aren't particularly exotic, but it does mean that you don't have to completely stare at me. Okay, share screen, that one. How does that look? Good, good. Okay, so this one. Aha, so that's what I'm going to talk about this session. I'll talk a bit about the system of committees in the Parliament. So it's really the basics of what committees are and what they do. It is reasonably dry, but I think it is important. Probably the one message that I'd like to leave you guys with today is that the better you target your input to a committee inquiry, the better chance you have of what you want to say, of your views and conclusions being adopted, and then carrying through the committee process to an eventual outcome. So it's probably worth finding out exactly where each inquiry is coming from. So I'll go through the framework of committees and the different varieties of committee that you're likely to encounter. Like I say, it's a little bit dry, but it's probably worth knowing. Then in the second half, I'll talk a bit more in detail about making a submission, what makes a good one, and also appearing as a witness in a public hearing if that's something that you end up doing. Okay, structures and types of committees. There are different types of committees. They're conceptually the same, but they're set up differently, and that can affect how they operate. When you're thinking about how committees are established, it's probably useful to start with a really obvious statement. Committees, parliamentary committees, are subcommittees of the Parliament. So they are bits of Parliament that have detached to work on their own particular issue and then report back to the Parliament. And that's sometimes worth remembering when you see the formalities that are involved in making a submission and appearing as a witness. It can seem a little bit over the top, but it's not just a working group or just a group of people. It is actually a proceeding of Parliament just operating in a small group. So both the House of Representatives and the Senate have really well-developed committee systems that have been operating for a few decades. It's really embedded in the way that Parliament works, and they really couldn't do without them now. Committees tend to reflect portfolio lines, and they're often rearranged at the start of the Parliament to reflect portfolio changes of the current government. So there are House, Senate, and joint committees. That's just a function of their membership. House committees have members of Parliament on them. Senate committees only have senators, and joint committees have both. So the next dot point shows that there are a variety of ways to establish committees. So you can do it by standing orders, and most committees are established by standing orders. If you're not familiar with what the standing orders are, they're the rules that Parliament adopts at the start of each Parliament, each session, to govern itself. So basically the rules about who can speak and how you pass a piece of legislation. And those standing orders also set up a number of committees. Now, the general purpose committees of the House and the legislative and references committees of the Senate. Some committees can also be established by statute, so under legislation. And these are often set up when a whole new something is introduced, like a whole new raft of intelligence and security measures also introduced the Parliament's Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Or when they did the law enforcement integrity stuff, they established the Committee on Law Enforcement Integrity as a way of oversight and accountability. So when you're selling a big change, part of it is often, but we're also setting up a parliamentary committee to look at how we're doing it and give a bit of oversight and accountability of that, of those new things. And the last one on that second dot point is a resolution. So at any time, either or both houses of the Parliament can decide they need a parliamentary committee for a specific thing, and they can just set one up. And the houses can do it on their own, or that they can do it together and they pass the resolution at the same time. The powers and functions of those committees that are set up by resolution are set out in the resolution, and that's on the committee website. And it is often worth just having a quick squiz at those, because it'll set out what the committee's for, what the membership is, who's on it, and what they can and can't do. And that can sometimes be difficult to know as you're doing your submission. The third dot point, how long they are. Committees by statute exist forever. Standing orders committees are set up usually for the life of the Parliament. And select committees exist for the life of the task. So they're often set up to do a specific inquiry, and when they're finished, when they report back, they cease to exist. So currently there's a Senate Select Committee on COVID-19 that's having hearings at the moment. The House of Representatives doesn't do this very often. The Senate does it more because it's not controlled by the government. So if there's an issue that the government doesn't want the politicians to look into, the Senate has the numbers to set up a select committee. And quite often they can set them up so that they're chaired by the crossbench or by the opposition. And the COVID-19 is an example of that. Senator Gallagher's the chair. And that can be important to know because it can affect how the chair manages the committee. And it can also affect how much weight the government will give to implementing those committees' recommendations. So that's something that's useful to find out. And the last dot point is that the committees are supported by small secretariats of parliamentary staff. That's us, that's me. So I'm the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, and there's 9 of us that support that committee. It is a big committee. We do advisory, research, drafting, admin support, organise things, draft a report, all that kind of thing. We're employed by the Department of the House of Representatives and in the Senate by the Department of the Senate, and we're parliamentary staff, not political staff, that live through changes of governments and through new parliaments. And we're required by our jobs to be apolitical, and we really are here to help. So if you do have any questions about the process or about the inquiry, just pick up the phone or send us an email and we can explain things. With the caveat that we can't really talk about the behind the scenes work of the committee, but we can talk about how it should be working. So this is what I've just been talking about, but as a sort of a picture. So it illustrates the different ways that you can differentiate committees by membership, by method of establishment, and by duration, whether they're select or whether they're standing. There are a lot of committees. and there is a lot of duplication, particularly if an area is very much in the public eye. Like I've got the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. There is a Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. We do a lot of overlap, and there is a lot of duplicated work, particularly for witnesses who do often have to appear twice or give 2 submissions to what looks like very similar inquiries. The only thing I'd say about that, and I'll talk a bit more about it later, is that committee work often has a cumulative effect. So saying the same thing to 2 different sets of people can get you more than twice the bang for your buck if you become part of a sort of a groundswell of opinion or information on a particular subject. So membership. It's probably not critical to know all the ins and outs of membership of committees, although if you are appearing as a witness in a public hearing, I do recommend doing a bit of research on the members, because they definitely have their interests and they definitely have their hobby horses when it comes to questions and what they want to find out. Only members of parliament can serve on parliamentary committees, and I mention that because in some countries that's not the case, and they can second eminent persons and experts onto their committees. We can't do that, unfortunately. It sounds quite good. Committee members are always backbenchers, so ministers don't serve on committees, and that comes down to your basic constitutional separation of powers. Ministers are part of the executive, and this is a bit of parliament that's operating. It's also practical reasons. Committee work's quite time consuming. Ministers don't usually have the time. And members of the shadow ministry don't usually serve on committees either for the same reason. That's not a hard and fast rule though, that just tends to be the practice. So working with backbenchers is really interesting because there is, I suppose, a spectrum of independence from the party positions. You know, they are quite often their interests align on party lines, but you can also have discussions and conversations and reach consensus about things that don't necessarily align with the publicly stated party positions. It also means that in a parliament like this one, where there's a very small majority, so a small number of backbenchers, they have to do a lot of work, and they're often on multiple committees and race from one to the other. So as I said, there's representation from all sides of politics, usually in proportion to the representation in the parliament. Majority government, minority opposition, and a few crossbenchers for fun. The ability of a committee to reach a bipartisan view or a multi-partisan view on a contentious topic is a really important feature of committee work, and committees tend to put a lot of effort into reaching some kind of agreement if they possibly can. I should mention some other committees actually. There are party backbench committees, and there's some sort of friendship groups and other sorts of committees. They're not parliamentary committees, they're internal working committees. They operate differently and don't do the range of work that parliamentary committees do. And I don't know much more about them than that. So sizes of committees will vary. The largest is my one, the Foreign Affairs, which has 32 members. Most have sort of between 8 and 12. The Senate can have substitute members and participating members, and it can be unlimited. So you can get the whole of the Senate participating in a particular inquiry. The House is limited to 4. So it's probably worth knowing, even if you do your research on membership, particularly with Senate committees, that other senators can still wander in and ask questions. Most committees are chaired by a government member, with the deputy chair as a non-government member. The chair has a lot of control over the committee, usually sets the agenda, sets the focus. As I said, most decisions are made by consensus and agreement, which is great. But a lot can depend on that relationship between the chair and the deputy chair as to where they take their inquiries and where they get in the end. Members are appointed to the various committees by a motion of the respective house. That's the formality. In practice, most members nominate for the committees that they're interested in, or that either they have a personal interest in, or that is important to their electorate, which is a good thing to know. Anyway, you probably don't need all that detailed information, but the individuals who make up the committee really do have a strong impact on the outcomes. And I was talking about cumulative effect, and the networks that individual members make with their outside organisations, such as you, which isn't necessarily visible to us, it does have a cumulative effect. You know, you can meet with them in their offices and talk them through the issues, and then meet more formally as part of a parliamentary committee, talk through the issues and explore them a bit more. And that kind of build-up can make a noticeable difference to eventual outcomes. Right, so that does lead me to what is the whole point of committees, what is the purposes. There are a number of purposes, and if you're interested to try and move a committee towards a particular outcome, it can be useful to know where the head is at in terms of which of these particular outcomes they're most focused on. So first one is scrutiny and accountability, holding the government to account. And it's separation of powers again. It's easy to forget in our system where our ministers actually sit in the Parliament, but it's the Parliament that gives the money to the executive to spend. The executive then reports back to the Parliament, is accountable to the Parliament on how they spend it. And a big part of that accountability is actually through the committee system. So a precise example of this would be the Intelligence and Security Committee review listing of terrorist organisations under the Criminal Code. So the government says this is a terrorist organisation, and that triggers a reference to the Intelligence Committee who look at it and decide whether it's an okay thing to do. And a much broader example is that Senate COVID-19 Select that's just been set up. Its terms of reference are the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the government did a lot of things and the committee can review all of them. So that's a very retrospective function. It looks backwards at what's happened. In the House in particular, they mostly do a prospective function. They mostly do inquiries to think, what should happen in the future? What should the policy be? So in theory in Parliament, of course, this can happen when they're debating bills. So at the point at which a piece of legislation is introduced, then you start talking about the pros and cons. But in practice, of course, that's way too late. Once the legislation has been drafted, then it's really hard to go back from its underpinning premises. The Parliament really needs a much earlier way to inquire and report on complex issues, and that's where committees come in. So current inquiries are things like financing faster rail for Australia, or Australia's waste management and recycling industries. These are really broad topics. The inquiries usually take at least a year to complete, and they're done by committees because the Parliament as a whole couldn't possibly do them. So those dot points there are on why committees can move around from place to place, or they used to. Committees do have the power to summon witnesses and documents, although they generally operate on a voluntary basis. They can meet with a whole range of people. They operate in public, and it's quite important that all the proceedings are out there in the public domain so people can see how they reach the conclusions that they reach. And they're protected by parliamentary privilege. So I'll talk about this a bit more later, but in a nutshell, parliamentary privilege gives special rights and immunities that protect people, safe space for the discussions and the inquiries to happen. It does allow the public to have direct input to the work of Parliament. Anyone can make a submission to an inquiry, and anyone does, let me tell you, which is great. And in fact, when I retire, I think I'm going to get a second hobby in making submissions on anything and everything that Parliament does. It can be a good forum for debating public policy because there's always a wide range of topics. It's interesting what I was saying about backbenchers because they do reflect the broader Australian community. You have a range of people and they will be particularly interested in wheat farming or tourism or manufacturing, or they'll be very focused on climate issues or very socially conservative. And that's a reflection of them as persons, and it's also a reflection of the way their electorate thinks. So you get that diversity there. The very last thing I'll mention is, in terms of purpose, is bills inquiries, where a committee looks at a specific bill before it becomes law. So during the passage of legislation, at some point, instead of it just going through, the House will decide to send it off to a committee for further inquiry. Again, the Senate does this a bit more than the House, but either can do them and have done them in the past. They're quite limited inquiries because it's just about a specific piece of legislation. But if it does touch on your area of interest, then I recommend getting involved because they can often be an arena to thrash out specific opposition and crossbench objections, and the agreement that the committee reaches can be reflected in the final shape of the bill. So there's an immediacy of result with bills inquiries that you might not always see in those broader policy inquiries. So talking about result, this is the possible outcomes of committee work. So what can you see as a result of a committee inquiry? Committees almost always make recommendations to government and report those back to the Parliament. And it can lead to policy, administrative or legislative change. Now, I don't want to talk this up too much because by and large, governments don't go, wow, that was 40 amazing recommendations, we're going to implement them all immediately. That doesn't usually happen. But often you can see a line where committees have added their voices to a lot of other voices to get change. And you can see where the committee process is fed into a variety of other policy work that's going on to change policy over a long period of time and get a concrete result. They can also sometimes just show up little things that nobody's thought of that can be changed immediately. Somebody has said, look, if we got this regulatory change, it would solve half our problem. And that regulatory change can be made quite simply. Committees can expose financial inadequacy of agencies and departments. That's the oversight function that I talked about earlier. Committees aren't generally very good at getting outcomes for individuals. The process tends to be a bit time consuming and also a bit public if you're talking about individuals' problems. If you want to raise individual issues, then I recommend directly to the minister or someone like the Ombudsman's office. Public debate of important issues. Just airing the issues, of course, can be an outcome in itself. You know, you get issues, you get media exposure, you get more public debate about important matters. And as I said earlier, we almost always operate entirely in public. Live broadcasts, transcripts are prepared, and the transcripts are published. So when people say things in committees, it's quite hard to back away from them. It allows the community to directly participate in the debate. It's one of the very few places where people with an interest can talk directly in public to Parliament. I've put educating the members at the end because it's not exactly a primary outcome of committee work, but it is often a chance where backbenchers get to learn about specific policy areas, strategic policy development. They get to learn about government processes and the bureaucracy. And they also get to learn about community opinion beyond their electorate, which is really important. And, you know, backbenchers, they may well end up in the ministry one day. So educating them about the way that this all works, I think, is an invaluable part of committee work. It's considered to be a good training ground for new MPs. Okay, so this is the absolute final piece of the theoretical foundation, parliamentary privilege. So proceedings of Parliament are exempt from the ordinary law. This includes committees. And even though they don't really come up very often as issues, the concept of privilege underpins almost everything that committees do. So it's primarily there to protect the members in the course of their parliamentary duties. So they're accountable back to Parliament, not to the executive, i.e. the police. You probably already know that you can't be sued for anything you say in a committee or anything you write in a submission, and that creates that safe space for people to talk. Now, that fact that you can't be sued is actually quite a big deal. It denies some people some serious rights, i.e. the people you are slandering have their rights taken away from them. So committees make you go through some hoops before they'll put that umbrella of privilege over you. In a hearing, they might stop if you start slandering people. In a submission, they might redact words, or they're required to offer a right of reply, which I'll talk about a bit later on. The other aspect of parliamentary privilege that might be relevant is there's an offence if you do anything that improperly interferes with the operation of Parliament. And that's mostly in relation to providing false or misleading evidence to committees. Very rare, but worth keeping in mind, just in case. Okay, making a submission. So that was all the theoretical background. So I'll move on now to the details of how you might prepare a submission to a parliamentary inquiry. So I've talked about different types of inquiries: policy, bills inquiries, accountability, very specific ones, very general ones. So this slide just addresses the technical requirements for making submissions. Firstly, there's no particular format. So we've had videos, we've had survey results, we've had paintings. Mostly though, it is a short written document. So as you've heard, submissions are protected by parliamentary privilege. In order for that to apply, they have to be relevant to the terms of reference. Luckily, most terms of reference are pretty broad and relevance is drawn pretty wide. This mostly applies to people who have a particular bee in their bonnet about something and will write in to anything that's not remotely relevant to the inquiry. And the committee generally decides to take that as correspondence to the committee. So it does get read by the members. It's just not published, and it won't be quoted in the report. So a submission has to be prepared for the purposes of the inquiry. It has to be new. If you have an existing publication that you think the committee would find helpful, then put a cover submission on it, perhaps pick out a couple of the key points and how you think it relates to the inquiry, and then either link to the existing publication or have it as an attachment. And we are happy for your submission to footnote or link to as many things as you think relevant. Just make a new cover for it, a new thing that links it to what the committee is currently doing. Meeting the deadline is really important. Some inquiries have deadlines that were referred either by the House or by a minister. We also have to work around the sitting calendar. So committees will want to wrap things up, because if they don't get the chance, it might be another couple of months before the House is sitting again. Even when there's no deadline, it's really important, even when there's no external deadline, it's important to meet the committee's deadline for submission, because the written submissions generally make the foundation stones of the inquiry. Until those submissions come in, we don't always know who's even interested, let alone what they have to say. So an inquiry will use the submissions to decide who to talk to in public hearings, how to schedule the inquiry, the kind of things even that we might be inquiring into. So for example, we've got a current inquiry into Australia's relationship with the Pacific, and we got some really good submissions early on about media freedom in the Pacific, which is not an issue that the committee had considered. But because those submissions were like, oh, this is an issue, we're now going to take the inquiry in that direction and consider a thing that we hadn't thought about considering before. So timely submission tends to be more effective, because it gives you a say in the direction that the inquiry will go as it evolves. Once you've submitted your submission, you can't withdraw it or amend it without the committee's permission. So it's not an iterative process. If something changes wildly after you've made your submission, then do a supplementary and do as many of those as you need to do. It's much better than going through the process of asking to withdraw and then rewrite. Often the committee won't let you, because they want a transparent public record of the evidence that they've received. As you know, web pages out there, they live forever. And if somebody looks at an archived version of the page and there's this submission, and then the new version has this submission, it leaves a gap in the sort of record of evidence, I suppose. The other part of that is that it has to be kept confidential until the committee says that it can be published. Sometimes that'll be the next day. Sometimes it might be several weeks before the committee's authorised publication. And we really appreciate that this can be quite annoying, because once you put your submission in, you want to share it with people, you want to put it on your website and perhaps send it out to other similar organisations so that they know what you're doing, but you can't. And that is actually to protect the person who's making the submission. If it's published before the authorised its publication, then you lose your nexus with parliamentary proceedings. You can impact any later claim of privilege, and it might even undermine the evidentiary weight that we give to that submission. So that's the reason for that. Okay, so this next one is not the technical requirements, but the effectiveness requirements. They are the things that make a submission more effective and that make my job much easier, because good quality submissions are just our absolute lifeblood. We couldn't do anything without them. So the inquiry, essentially, you're collecting evidence, and the evidence is wildly varied, so we do weight it. Some evidence is simply taken more seriously than others by the Secretariat and by the committee. Good quality evidence is more likely to be quoted in the report. It's got more chance of forming the committee conclusions and influencing the final recommendations. Committee members are really good at quick sifting information. They get a lot of information in their jobs and assessing it. So you need decent substantiation, basically. Footnotes are fine. Referring to publications is an excellent plan. That fourth dot point, focus on what you know. So I would say that all of you are probably quite used to having discussions about your niche, or whatever, however you describe it, your value add, the way in which your organisation does something that no one else can. And you think about how you position yourself strategically to create a space for yourself. You know, a lot of you are operating in quite crowded environments. So that viewpoint is the one that we want you to bring to submissions. The committee wants to know the thing that only you know and that they would never find out otherwise. Foreign Affairs, we currently have 4 of our subcommittees have 4 separate inquiries into Australia's relationship with the Pacific in terms of defence, in terms of trade, in terms of human rights, in terms of aid. And they're all really broad in scope. So, you know, in that case, sure, if you wrote the book about Australia and the Pacific since 1945, then give us an overview submission. If you're that person, then that's fine. But if you're an NGO with a focus on sports links, or if you supply eco-housing, then that's what we want to hear about, your experiences in relation to what you do there and how it relates to the inquiry that we're doing. So similarly to that, don't worry about addressing every term of reference or even structuring your submission around the terms of reference. You can if it's helpful, but you certainly don't need to. There's no rules around length, but it might help if you think of submissions as having 2 audiences. Secretariat, and we're researchers and we're looking for good stuff that we can quote. We respect footnotes. We generally write the bulk of the report. So convince us. But the other audience, of course, is members of Parliament and their staff, and they want to get across it as quickly as they possibly can. So a summary is what I'm saying. It's very sensible for any report of more than about 5 pages. And if you have recommendations that you want to make, specific recommendations, then by all means add those in as well. They're quite useful for us to see. The other really good things are case studies and examples. Excellent way of getting the point across, and they're really good for us to quote in the report. Look, this is just the technical way of lodging a submission. I'm encouraging everybody to do online submissions rather than emailing us. The advantage of using our website is that you get an instant acknowledgement, whereas if you leave it for us, you might wait a few days before you even get an acknowledgement of receipt. The only thing I'd say about using the website is don't try and do it 10 minutes before the deadline, because that's when everybody does it and it'll probably crash. The other thing I'll say about the website is, does everybody know about My Parliament? You can set up your own login on My Parliament and then use it to track things. So you can track legislation, you can track senators and members' speeches, you can track committees as a whole, and you can track specific committee inquiries. And if you set it up, then you'll receive an update whenever anything changes. And you can set it up to make it daily, weekly, even monthly, I believe. So there's a track inquiry or a track committee button on most committee website pages. And if you set up your My Parliament and you click that, then you'll get to know whenever there's a public hearing, whenever a report's been made, that kind of thing. I can't promise that it's not 100% glitchy, but it's there and it should be used. Okay, so that was making submissions, putting in your written evidence. The other way that they gave evidence is through through public hearings, talking to people face to face. So hearing from people, that asking and answering of questions is absolutely invaluable. And it surprised me when I came here 5 years ago, just how much of the work was still going to places and talking to people. And I must admit, until a couple of months ago, we hardly used teleconferencing and video conferencing facilities. Committee members really liked, for a number of reasons, really liked the idea of getting out into the community and actually talking to people in person wherever possible. It will be really interesting to see if anything changes when we're back to normal. This has been super convenient, particularly for me, but face-to-face really does have its unique advantages. So public hearings, the best ones I've been in have been conversations, you know, where issues are examined, concepts are explored, and people build on each other's points. They're really good for clarifying uncertainty because, you know, when you hear somebody's question, it gives you an idea of where they're coming from and what they're thinking. And it gives witnesses a chance to perhaps correct or clarify any misapprehensions. And often the best thing a witness can say is, I'm sorry, I think we're at cross purposes. You're talking about this and I'm talking about this. And it irons out those little differences. And even though it is broadcast and a transcript is taken and the transcript is published, it is a chance to be more open and less constrained than putting things in writing. particularly because it doesn't have to go through the internal clearance process that a written thing does. So witnesses can be summoned, but that's incredibly rare. Almost all witness appearances are voluntary. I've put arrive at least 15 minutes there, even though it's a tiny thing. If it's a public hearing on a sitting day, then the clock is absolutely king. Members are usually oversubscribed, double booked for most of their sitting days, which means they will come and go during hearings. It's not because you're boring, it's because they've got something else to do. And witnesses are expected to be available when they're needed, because meetings can run early and they can sometimes run late. Oh, and of course we have divisions. Members can vanish to vote during a committee hearing, which is a little awkward. That's why I like a joint committee. You see, the House members can wander off, they still keep going, the senators can wander off, and you still keep going. So usually the chair will open proceedings and read out some formalities. This is formal advice to witnesses, and this bit's actually required under the Parliament's resolution for the protection of witnesses. So it's a bit like, you know, reading your rights. They have to do it. Almost always the chair will offer you as a witness the chance to make a short opening statement. I really recommend taking this opportunity wherever possible. It gives the chance for the members to get in the right headspace. It allows you to set out those things that you think are most important. Always assume that the members have read your submission, because they almost always have, but it's usually worth taking an opening statement, picking out the most important things and bringing them together in an opening statement. Always less than 5 minutes. If you think you're going to go over 5 minutes, check with the Secretariat first, because it might not fly. And then we move into a question and answer format that the chair will manage. And that varies from committee to committee. Some are really strict about allowing opposition and government members equal time, and some will just go with the flow, and they'll just, whoever puts their hands up first gets to ask the next question. So that last dot point, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. Hearings are usually public unless there's a reason why not. So there is a significant public interest in having committee inquiries in public. So recorded, transcribed, transcript on the website, media present, audience can live tweet, and they've certainly done that in the past, the whole thing. If, as a witness, you would like to go in camera, if you'd like to have your evidence heard in private, then you can ask to do so. The committee will ask for reasons, and if you've got reasons, then they almost always agree. Okay, so just 3 more general points about appearing at a public hearing, and they all link back to privilege again. So if you don't stick to the terms of reference, privilege might not apply. And the third one is the possible contempt that I talked about earlier. It's interesting because it's another of those really broad in theory principles that are difficult to enforce in practice. I actually did a research paper about it for a Parliamentary Nerd Conference last year about how often it had actually been enforced. And for the House of Representatives, the answer is never, even if people have given committees completely the wrong information. Sorry, I probably shouldn't tell you that. But I will say that it can be a career-limiting move if the committee gets annoyed at the evidence that's been given and chose to name you personally on the floor of Parliament. Okay, so the next one is, this is purely practical. It certainly shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. It's phrased as positives. These are the things that you should do. I've sat on the committee side of the desk and watched many witnesses, and I'll give you some negatives, things that you probably shouldn't do. The first one is not knowing what you're talking about. And I don't mean you have to be an expert on everything, but if you're not the person that knows about the stuff that's in the submission, then it doesn't tend to go down very well. It's perfectly okay not to answer a certain question. The committee's almost always happy for you to take things on notice if you don't know a specific point. But sometimes organisations simply send the wrong person. They send somebody that's maybe too senior and doesn't know the details, or isn't senior enough and isn't comfortable answering a lot of questions. And that's probably the biggest no-no. Sometimes I see witnesses not listening to the question and giving the wrong answer, giving a perfectly fine answer, but it's not actually what the member was asking. Sometimes witnesses, this is probably be pretty rare with you guys, but sometimes with government departments, you see them being unnecessarily adversarial, like they think they're in estimates and they're about to be forensically cross-questioned. Most inquiries, most policy inquiries just aren't like that. Committees genuinely want to know information, and often they genuinely appreciate that they have world-class experts sitting in front of them. They have the person who knows the most in their field, and they're really appreciative of that knowledge. Having said that, sometimes committee members might have an objection to your organisational principle, and they might be a bit narky. It's best to play that with a completely straight bat, and just to get as much persuasive and credible evidence into the committee debate and on the record as you can. So this is just a few more, oops, where am I? Yeah, so we've covered most of this. I might just draw to your attention the second dot point, which is about if you think there might be any problems with any of the evidence that you're saying, think it through beforehand. The example I'm thinking of is if your organisation has, say, been involved in a particular individual case, like you've been advocating for a particular migrant worker or something that's blown up, think about it beforehand and have your answer ready. And if your answer is, we can't talk about that, we're not going to talk about that in public, perhaps we could give you a separate written brief, just have that ready, because members do obviously take account of what's in the public domain at the moment. And if you think there's something that might be a little bit problematic, then have your answer ready for that one. Witnesses' responsibilities don't end at the hearing. Check and correct the transcription. I will say that that's just transcription only. If you said it, then they won't change it, even if you think you might have said it a bit better or said something else. It's really just about have they accurately recorded the things that you said. Providing additional information is really important. Like I said, committees are usually happy for you to take something on notice and look into it and get back to them with the answer in writing. There might be a really quick deadline for that. If they're really close to the time when they want to put in their report, you might have to answer that supplementary question or question on notice before the transcript comes in. So as a witness, or as somebody who's there supporting a witness sitting in the gallery, one of the best things you can do is write down that question in as much detail as possible. The other tip I'd give is it's perfectly okay to say, so what exactly did you just ask me? What exact information am I meant to be providing? Because often the conversation can boom around a bit and then somebody will say, oh, you can take it on notice. And they're not entirely sure what exactly they're taking on notice. So those were responsibilities. These are witnesses' rights. There are resolutions passed by both houses that protect witnesses. The first three protect you from the committee. So you can't be dragged up without warning and without knowing what the hearing is about. You can't be asked about irrelevant things, and you must be treated with respect and dignity. So estimates, sometimes sails pretty close to the wind, but witnesses shouldn't be belittled or abused by a committee. At the time, you raise it with the chair, who has responsibility for control of the meeting. If you don't feel comfortable doing that at the time, and I totally understand why, then you can raise it afterwards with the Secretariat, with the chair, or if you feel like going nuclear, you can raise it with the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, because they are ultimately the people who enforce those rules. And the last three things there protect you from other people. The first one actually occurs. The franchising inquiry in the Senate last year, year before, had franchising organisations writing to their franchisees to say don't appear before this committee, and that is or could amount to a contempt of Parliament. And you have the right to make corrections and to provide additional evidence, and you have the right to give a right of reply. So if someone's slagging you off in a committee hearing, you can't sue them, but you do have a right to put your side of the case to the committee. And this has happened. This happened in our current human rights inquiry. So somebody put in a submission that gave adverse reflections on someone else. We gave them a right of reply and then put both documents up on the website together so that anybody watching can see both sides of that issue. Okay, and lastly, it's just some ways of staying informed about committee inquiries as well as the My Parliament option. Twitter's good. We actually only use Insta for inquiries that we think it might be relevant for the young people. But otherwise Twitter's probably the best way of finding out what's going on. Right, so that was pretty much more about committees than you'll ever want to know, but I'm more than happy to have a chat or answer any questions that anyone has.
Thanks so much, Lynley. That was, there's never too much to know about parliamentary processes, and I was just wondering about the Parliamentary Nerd Conference you mentioned. Any bits, yeah. How do we get tickets to that? We do have a couple of questions that have come through on the chat. If I might ask some, and then I also have some myself. As you were talking through, I was thinking about a few things. There's a question here from Olivia who asks about joint select committees. She has said, where it is a joint select committee established in the Senate, despite the involvement of both House and Senate, presumably that would still have less likelihood of the government's view of the committee or likelihood of implementing recommendations.
Yeah, joint selects are interesting. They're pretty rare. If it's a joint select, then it's gone through both houses. So for whatever reason, the government has agreed to put it through the House of Representatives, but they can be set up with opposition chairs. I actually was a secretary for the Joint Select Committee on Government Procurement that Senator Xenophon chaired as a crossbench member. And that was an interesting experience because it was an opportunity for everybody to have their issue, to have their say, to have their spiel about government procurement. Now, the recommendations in those, in that case, weren't enthusiastically taken up from memory, but it was definitely an issue that was forefront of everybody's mind about buying Australian. Sorry, has that really answered the question?
I think so. I don't know. It's just one of those, I guess also it potentially comes down to actual committee membership makeup too, in terms of people, personalities involved in the committee that come from both houses. So
yeah. Yeah, very much. And actually, if the committee has gone through both houses to be set up, then it is often an issue either that the government wants aired or that they think is not problematic enough to be worth blocking.
Yeah. We have another question, a great question from Kelly, who asks, is there a process that tracks the number of committee recommendations that have been implemented?
Oh, now that is an excellent question. It is a really, really hard thing to do because so the government has to respond. They have to respond within either 3 or 6 months, and the Speaker every 6 months tables a list of what reports have and haven't been responded to. So there's a way of tracking whether the government responds or not. The trouble with most of the responses is it should be, yes, we're going to do it. No, we're not going to do it. But often there's a lot of halfway houses, which is like, noted. Here are all the ways in which we're currently half doing it. So when you come to collect the statistics, you think, now, is that a yes, we're doing it? Or is it a no, we're not going to do it? Yeah, we would love it to be a measure of our effectiveness. If recommendations are, the committees are more effective, but we just can't measure it. It would be lovely to report.
Yeah.
So short answer, no. But it's a lot of PhD topics, put it that way.
Another question from Emily, who has asked, how can people from directly impacted communities best participate in public hearings? Do committees respond to real people as well as policy experts? Oh,
excellent question. It is one of the weaknesses of committees is that they don't go directly into affected communities as often as they should. And that it's the people the policy experts and the known quantities, because they're easy to contact and we know that they are a known quantity, that we tend to go to first. Committees do this. So, I mean, the Murray-Darling, it was a few years ago now, but that was a 1 month road show through all the affected communities. I'm currently doing a PFAS inquiry, and that really should or was planned to, before this year happened, to go to the affected communities and have a round table with them. The best way that committees do this, as opposed to formally getting witnesses into a committee room and grilling them for 45 minutes, they will often have round tables or town hall meetings where people get, they get a 3-minute, this is how it affects me. The main problem with directly engaging with communities is knowing where to start. If the communities, have organised and there's an obvious contact point, then they're a lot easier to get in contact with. So, if that's something that you can assist communities with, then that would be fantastic to give them in and a way to get to them. Mm.
So I know that many organisations that are probably listening here and joining on this work with people with lived experience in terms of whatever the cause or issue is that is related to an inquiry process. Yeah. How important is it for them to say, it could be a peak body, for instance, or an organisation that does policy and advocacy, but they have networks of people with lived experience. How important is that then for that organisation to contact the Secretariat and say, this is our network, that sort of informal conversation, pick up the phone, have a chat to the Secretariat to say, we're going to be providing a submission to this process, but we also have our stakeholders, we have our community that we think should be involved in this. How do we go about that?
That would be fantastic. That would be a really important thing to do and a really useful way of us getting that into that community. That would be really great. It does depend on the inquiry. So sometimes the committee deliberately broad pitches it. They say, look, we know that this directly affects, but we actually just want to look at the macro effects of this policy. We don't want to get into how it will affect people's lives for time reasons. Yeah. But then in other times, they're saying, look, the most important thing we can do is actually talk to the people who are going to be affected by this. And I did the Select Committee on Intergenerational Welfare Dependence in the last Parliament, and there's a lot of statistics about that because of the intergenerational aspect. But one of the most useful things that they did was actually tour relief housing in Adelaide and just talk to people who are living under the current welfare system and what it's meant for them and for their children. And that was really vital. That was really good things for them to do. Yeah.
Lynley, we've got a couple of questions here around dissenting reports.
Oh, yeah.
A question from Kelly that says, are committee recommendations more likely to be implemented if there is no dissenting report?
Short answer, yes. Yeah. Having said that, there are a few issues. There are a few where the Australian Greens will always dissent because that is really a core thing to them. So that sort of that kind of dissent isn't as I suppose as damaging to the gravity of the recommendations as one that has half a dozen dissenting reports from all parties. But generally, yeah, consensus recommendations carry a lot more weight. They really do. Not least because to get to a consensus recommendation, the recommendations have often been quite widely socialised. They don't come as a surprise to people. So yeah, consensus recommendations are often the goal. And I do see significant movement from starting points in doing those recommendations, in reaching the final recommendations. So it's definitely not a cut and dried thing.
And then Emma has a question around dissenting reports, just asking, can you expand on dissenting reports in the government response? She probably just sort of touched on about a little bit of that in that response as well.
Yeah, sure. Look, any committee member can put in a dissenting report, even a government member that disagrees with the conclusions the committee has made. They can also put in additional comments if they think the report hasn't gone far enough. So a dissenting report doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it. It might even mean that you think it should do more. Government responses are supposed to always also respond to the recommendations if there are any in the dissenting reports. They don't always, but they should. But yeah, they don't tend to treat them with as much seriousness or go into as much detail in their responses.
Thank you. And there's just a final question in the chat around cost, the average cost of what an inquiry is, and if you would have any idea on that.
Nice, that's an excellent question. Let's see. So I support, yeah, no, it's almost impossible because I'm not sure how you calculate members' time. The committee office as a whole has a budget of about 8 or 9 million, which is almost entirely staff. So that's what it costs to support half of all the parliamentary committees, and that includes the travel, staff travel, but then member time, member cost, and member travel is not visible to us, unfortunately. So sort of rule of thumb, an average inquiry would be into the 6 figures, I reckon.
Wow. Awesome. Just a question in terms of obviously deadlines and submissions, and organisations put in submissions and there's timelines that go with that. But often organisations are releasing other research, the inquiry process is happening, the submission deadline's passed, surveys have been published, research has been published that's new. How important, and is there still opportunity to be providing that sort of new research and new information to you as the Secretariat?
Yeah, definitely. Particularly if it's publicly available information that we don't need to put through the formal committee process, then by all means, if you think it's going to be relevant to the inquiry, then let us know. Inquiries do tend to develop their own momentum. So towards the end of the inquiry, new information probably won't be incorporated because we're so far down the path. But in the early stages, yeah, absolutely. If you think it's something that would be interested in and is relevant to your submission or generally, then by all means send it through.
Wonderful. I think that's sort of the end of the questions, and we're sort of nearly time to wrap up. That hour has gone quite quick. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that came out from that was some gems that I think that organisations need to be thinking about when we're working through these processes. The My Parliament function on the website is something that I use quite a lot, and I do encourage others to do the same. It's just a helpful tool so you don't have to be actively going, oh yeah, I need to check up on that. It's just something that you can be jumping into. So I do encourage everyone, if you are involved in an inquiry process, or if there's members that you know are a champion on your particular issue, I do encourage you to jump on and use the track function, because it does take the work out of having to actively search for those things yourself. Lynley also made a great point about formats of submissions, which I think is really important for people that work in spaces with people with lived experience that don't necessarily have the capacity or resources to be doing the submission writing themselves. So that the idea of videos and those types of things, I think, is something that we as organisations working with people with lived experiences and people that have accessibility issues, that's something to keep in mind for us, to be thinking about that. And then the final point was just around how you called committees training grounds for members. And I think that's really, really valuable for us to know in terms of our government relations activities that we're doing outside of just the usual the committee process, So having those meetings and the usual things that we're doing, and being engaged in the parliamentary processes, knowing who the members are of these committees, and if we're keeping constantly engaged and knowing that they're part of these processes and that they're champions for particular causes, it's just that constant engagement. So I really think that's an important point, that that's a takeaway from today, that these potentially are seen as training grounds for members, and be thinking about that as part of our government activities.
Not all members.
Yes. So other than that,
Feel bad now.
No, I think it's an important point, because it's part of our, because I know a lot of organisations do government relations, and it's just thinking about, and that's what we're thinking about, because often getting into ministers' offices and assistant ministers' offices is really tricky because of time constraints. So knowing that there's others within Parliament that are working in processes that want to hear about our issue is really important. So on that note, I want to thank Lynley for that really useful insights today. We really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for attending this seminar. we'll be locking in some more over the coming months, so keep an eye out for that. Other things that are happening in the for purpose world is we have our strategic communication and messaging online intensive coming up at the end of July with the awesome Gemma picture. So spots are limited, so if you're interested, you should definitely check that out. The for purpose sale has been extended for a week, so if you're thinking about professional development opportunities, you should definitely check out some of the great sale bundles that we have. By the end of the week, you'll get an email from Connie with a link to this seminar and short feedback survey and all the additional information around for purpose. So keep an eye out. Thank you again for joining us today, and a big thank you to Lynley for that really great presentation. I know that everyone is really super busy, so we really appreciate you coming and sharing your time. And thank you for your insights, Lynley. And I know you've got a committee hearing this afternoon, so good luck with that. And everyone enjoy the rest of your week and stay safe.